Esther. Here we go. I'm excited about this. I'll tell you a little secret. This is not how I choose every sermon series I'm going to do, but it is how I chose this one. Amy Allen, who I don't think is here today, she was teaching the kids on Wednesday night back a few months ago, and she gave all the kids a challenge to, over a 2-week span, read the book of Esther. And Lydia, my middle daughter, came home and she said, "Daddy, will you read Esther to me?" Now, when your child asks you to read the Bible to them, what's your answer? Very good. So over the course of about a week, we read a couple of chapters a day. And it was then that I decided I was going to preach through Esther after I finished Titus. Because I read it and I thought, man, this is an incredible story. And it's remarkable for several reasons that we're going to talk about this morning, and that I hope over the next several weeks become very, very clear to you. But we're just going to dive in this morning and really kind of let the story unfold for itself. Esther chapter 1, verse 1. Now in the days of Ahasuerus, now, that name's going to come up several times in this chapter. I want to make sure that we can all say it, because I've practiced it, and now you get to practice it. Ahasuerus. 1, 2, 3 together. Ahasuerus. Now his Greek name is probably easier to say, and he's more well known by his Greek name, but this is Xerxes the First. Xerxes the First was son of King Darius, who is the one who gave the Jewish people permission to go back to the Promised Land and to rebuild the temple and the city of Jerusalem. That's kind of how the Persians did things. They allowed people to go back to their own lands and to worship their own gods. And they figured that by doing that those peoples would remain more loyal to them. Now, in the book of Esther, what we find is that there were a group of Jewish people who decided not to return to the Promised Land. In other words, they stayed where they had arrived and where they had landed when they were originally taken into captivity by the Babylonians. But this story takes place in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. The Persian Empire was incredibly vast. That's what the author of Esther wants you to know right out of the gate. He then says in verse 2, "In those days when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the capital," there were 4 capital cities in the Persian Empire. This was the winter capital. Any other time of the year it probably would have been too hot to live there. It's about 150 miles north of the Persian Gulf, kind of near the borders of Iraq and Iran. In the 3rd year of his reign, about 483 BC, he gave a feast for all of his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and governors of the provinces were before him, while he showed the riches of his glory. Now, if you're the underlining type, you can underline that phrase. He showed the riches of his glory and the splendor and the pomp of his greatness for many days. In fact, 180 days. 6 months. Verse 5. "And when these days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa, the citadel, both great and small, a feast, lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were white cotton curtains and violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rods and marble pillars, and also couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry." Now, this was an incredibly rich guy. He had gemstones in his floor. Right? Just picture that. Verse 7, drinks were served in golden vessels, vessels of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. And drinking was according to this edict. There is no compulsion. For the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus. Now, those first 9 verses paint a particular picture. It's a picture of wealth and glory, of power and pleasure. It's a picture meant to draw us in and to wish that we were there. That we were participants in the party. That we could recline on golden couches and drink from golden goblets and be surrounded by servants who would give us all the best food. Man, this was the place to be. Not just for one day, not just for 1 week, but for 6 months. Now, some of you sitting in this room have probably partied before, and some of you have probably partied hard, and some of you may even think that the next party will be the best party, that it will give you the joy and satisfaction that you want. But I guarantee you, ain't nobody in here partied for 6 months straight like this. You and I don't have the resources to pull this off. Okay? We don't. None of us are Persian dictators with people to answer our every beck and call. Here's what I want you to know about this king. And this king is reflective of all of our hearts. In fact, there's not much difference between an ancient Persian dictator and you and me when it really comes down to it. This king wasn't satisfied. This king was not satisfied by all that he had. Remember I told you that it was 483 BC when this feast occurred. And King Ahasuerus is 3 years into his reign. And if you know anything about history, you know that at this point he's preparing to go to war with the Greeks. He had already defeated the Babylonians. He had already put down a skirmish in Egypt. And now he's going to go after the Greeks. And you need to know that his father tried to defeat them and couldn't. So, son has a little bit of a chip on his shoulder, a little bit of unfinished business to take care of. In other words, there's something or someone out there that he doesn't have that's living in defiance of him, and he just has to have it. He wanted what the Greeks had. He wanted them to bow the knee to him. And it didn't matter how large his empire already was. It needed to get bigger. And here's the question right at the outset of the book of Esther that you and I have to wrestle with as human beings who are ultimately no different from him. You and I have to come to terms with that gnawing sense of emptiness on the inside of us as well. The kind of emptiness that no doubt this ancient pagan king felt. And then you and I also have to come to terms with the fact that if this king, who seemed to have everything, thought that he needed more, how much will really be enough for you and for me? We'll never have as much as he did. And yet for him it wasn't enough. When you and I read these first 9 verses of Esther, you and I are supposed to be taken into all the pomp and the circumstance. And you and I are meant to wrestle with the fact that that's where our hearts go to. And we're supposed to ask ourselves the question, if he wasn't satisfied, then will I ever be satisfied no matter how much I give? One of our family's favorite bands is Drew Holcomb and the Neighbors. They're kind of a modern country Americana folk band. And they recently released a song, and here are some of the lyrics. Some people want a house on top of the hill. Some people want people to pay all their bills. Some people want to move on. Some people want to go back in time. Some people buy everything they want. Other people don't have a dime. You want what you can't have. Since the Garden of Eden, it's been like that. We're all in pursuit of something. That thing, that enough, that we think will satisfy our hearts. The king here at the beginning of Esther is a picture of a person who has all kinds of things, but isn't satisfied. Timothy Kane, in his book on Esther, says, the world calls you to do whatever it takes to become more like this king. But the book of Esther, as we're going to see, comes to unmask the facade and to show us the truth. Now, it's not just about the stuff. There's more than unsatisfied desire for more going on here. You see, Ahasuerus is trying to convince all of these officials at his party, all of these nobles and governors, all of these members of the army of Persia and Media, all of his entourage and his people, to back his upcoming war effort against the Greeks. This 187-day party is essentially a war council. And so he's parading all of his wealth in front of these people to try to convince everyone around him that he's enough so that they'll get behind him and support his war effort. Now, if you know anything about history, it did not go too well for him. The movie 300. Okay? The Battle of Thermopylae. That is Xerxes in the movie, and the Greeks withstood him and pushed him back. So he ends up being defeated. But here's what he's trying to do. What he's parading in front of all of these people, he's saying to them, if you'll back me, if you'll support me, guess what? This can be yours too. If they'll trust him, if they'll follow him, if by their support they'll tell him he's enough to conquer the Greeks. Now let me ask you a question. How many of us live with an insatiable desire to prove ourselves? How many of us thirst for the affirmation of others? How many of us just want someone to say to us, you're enough? You're enough. At the end of the day, remember, you and I are no different from this Persian dictator who lived some 2,500 years ago. Like him, our hearts are desperate to make sense of who we are. We are desperate to know that we matter. Y'all, we're all chasing down a kingdom. We're all trying to build one in the hope that one day we can stand back from it and we can admire it. We can look at our accomplishments and we can say, yeah, you know what? I am enough. Or we can invite other people to the party and we can say, look, and we can have them say to us, yeah, you are enough. But here's the problem. The walls of a kingdom like that are paper thin. They're paper thin. And all it takes sometimes is for someone or something to come along and to show us that we don't have as much control as we think we did, and the kingdom crumbles. All it takes is for one person, right? You all know this. You've experienced it. All it takes is for one person to say, you're not enough. And no matter how many people have said it, what happens to your world and my world? It crumbles. That's exactly what happens to the king. And we're meant to see this. We're meant to see his pomp and his glory and his circumstance exposed for what it is. Look at verse 10. On the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine. Now, I want to stop, okay? I don't want you to have in your mind that these parties are like presidential type affairs where everyone dresses in tuxedos and sits nicely and neatly at round tables and that they are dignified. Okay? These were like keggers. These were like frat parties. Okay? These were pagan people and they did pagan things. Right? So on the 187th day of this party, the king is wasted. Right? The king is merry with wine. And he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of the king Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, delivered by the eunuchs. At this, the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. You got to picture it. The first 9 verses are meant to show us how powerful this man is. That this man commands an empire of 127 provinces. That at this 187-day party, all of his nobles, all of his governors, all of his commanding officers from his army are before him, and they are in awe of him like you and me. And on the last day of this party, the king has shown them everything he possesses. And yet he thinks, wow, these guys need to see my wife. She's something else. And then his wife says, nope. I have more self-dignity than to come into a room full of drunk and wasted men and parade myself before them so they can do nothing but look at me and lust after me. Ain't happening. You see how paper thin that kingdom is? He may have commanded armies, but his own wife said, nope, nada, ain't happening. A man merry with wine suddenly becomes enraged. Why? Because she had done a very public thing. She had defied his authority in his own palace in front of all of these nobles and officials. And what you and I are meant to see is that this man is not the kind of king, and he doesn't have quite as much power as he himself thinks he does. His own wife disobeys a direct command. His emotions get the better of him. He can't even control himself. He's partied for 187 days, and it doesn't even make him happy. Marsina and Mehuman, 7 princes of Persia and Media, who saw the king's face and sat first in the kingdom. Now stop right there. It's going to become important later in the story. The king had 7 close advisors who were the only people who could come into the king's presence uninvited. So they had access to the king's face, is the way the text puts it. So he calls his closest advisors to himself, and in verse 15, the king says to them, according to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti because she has not performed the command of King Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs? Now notice the specific question that he asks them. It's a legal question. But notice the answer that he gets. Then Memucan said in the presence of the king and the officials, not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but also against all the officials and all the peoples who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt. Since they will all say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. This day, the noble women of Persia and Media, who have heard of the queen's behavior, will say the same to all the king's officials. In other words, this guy is purely a pragmatist. He's like, look, if the king couldn't get his own wife to obey him, what about our wives? This is going to affect affect me. All right? Keep reading. If it please the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. Key moment in the text, okay? Key moment regarding what's to come. Verse 20. So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, for it is vast, all the women will give honor to their husbands high and low. Yeah, right, just like the king. Okay? This advice pleased the king and the princes, and the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to every province in its own script, and to every people in its own language, that every man be master in his own household and speak according to the language of his people. Now, the author of Esther has an incredible sense of humor. As he exposes this paper-thin kingdom, he wants us to see several things. Okay, number one, the king and his officials didn't want this incident to be made public because they were afraid that other women in the kingdom would get the wrong idea and they would rise up against their husbands. Yet what did they do? They broadcast it. They broadcast it throughout the entire kingdom. They had it written in every language of every people group in the empire of Persia. Not only that, Vashti got exactly what she wanted. Think about it. She didn't want to come into the presence of the king in the first place, and Memucan said that Queen Vashti ought to never be allowed into the presence of the king again, and she probably went, jerk. Do you see what's happening here? All the pomp, all the glory, all the circumstance is completely exposed by the end of the chapter. So you have a man who sits on the throne of the Persian Empire, really the most powerful man in the world at the time, and he's not quite as powerful as he thinks he is, or that we might think he is. So the question is, who really is in charge here? And that's a question that's at the forefront of the entire book of Esther. And here's the bottom line. This entire scene in chapter 1 is a setup. The author wants you and I to marvel at the Persian king, and then by the end of the chapter to question all that we've seen so that you and I are prepared with the eyes of faith to see the real king at work throughout the book. And who is that real king? Psalm 47:2. For the Lord Most High is awesome, the great King over all the earth. Psalm 47:8. God reigns over the nations. God is seated on his holy throne. Psalm 103:19. The Lord has established his throne in heaven, and his kingdom rules over all. 1 Timothy 1:17. Now to the King, eternal, immortal, invisible, the only God, be honor and glory forever and ever. Amen. Who is the great King of the earth? It's not a pompous Persian dictator. It's God. And the author of Esther knew full well what he was doing when he started the story like this. He knew full well what he was doing when he wrote a book that not once mentions God's name. Not only that, there are no obvious miracles or indisputable divine interventions in the book of Esther. There's no prayer. There's no worship. There's no mention of the law, no temple, no Jerusalem. In fact, if this book were not in the Bible, it could easily be mistaken for an ancient, masterfully written short story about palace intrigue at some point in the Persian Empire. But the fact is, it is in our Bibles. And it's in our Bibles for a very particular purpose. The book of Esther reminds us that God often works in our world in hidden ways. Theologians use the word providence to describe the work that God does behind the scenes in our world. The work that God does to uphold our world and to bring things about in such a way that His will is always accomplished no matter the situation or the circumstance. The book of Esther reminds us that more often than not, God's providence is the way that God works in the world. He works in mostly hidden behind-the-scenes ways that are more often mundane than they are miraculous. Now, God has performed incredible acts throughout history, right? Acts that defy the imagination. Things recorded in places like Exodus, where God appeared to Moses in a burning bush, where his walking staff turned into a snake, where God came down in power and parted a sea so that his people could pass through. But listen, I want you to be honest with me. And I'm going to be honest with you for just a second. The world that we live in, at least from my perspective, often feels a lot more like Esther's world than it does an Exodus world. Oftentimes, I know that there are some of you who may wonder where God is in the midst of the trials and the sufferings and the things that you are wrestling with. I know that some of you, like me, may look around and find direct divine intervention hard to spot sometimes. In an Exodus world, God was undoubtedly and powerfully present time and time again in parting seas, in staffs that became snake, in a burning bush, and in manna from heaven. But you and I don't see that kind of stuff. That's where Esther comes in. Esther is there to teach us, to remind us, to educate our hearts in faith. Because as we walk throughout the story, you're going to be able to see God at work in all kinds of behind-the-scenes ways that remind us of the world that we live in. In other words, the book of Esther puts Romans 8:28 and 29 on display. Paul writes there, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. For those God foreknew, He also predestined to be conformed to the image of His Son, that He might be the firstborn among many brethren and sisters." Y'all, we know, Paul speaks of confidence here. We know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love Him and have been called according to His purpose. You and I will see that play out in the book of Esther. And I promise you, as we walk through it, things are going to get really bad before they get much better. And there will be points along the way, and I hope we can enter into them together, where you and I can say with the Jewish people, where is God? What is He doing? And I hope as we see the story play out, we'll be reminded that though God's work is often hidden, there is never a time that He's not at work. Now sometimes, you and I have to wait to see what God's doing. The author of the book of Esther had a vantage point that the characters in the story in the midst of real life didn't have. He knows the story from beginning to end. In the same way, our God knows the story from beginning to end. You and I are merely in the midst of chapter 5 or chapter 15, and we don't necessarily know the end from the beginning. And so sometimes you can only see what God is doing by looking in the rear view and seeing what God has done. Does that make sense? Now, here's the cool thing. This is not just a story about God's deliverance of the Jewish people in a particular place and then at a particular time. You see, this story sets in motion a series of events that preserves the people who will one day give birth to the Messiah, who will enter the world for the good and the salvation of all peoples. And just like God's work is hidden from view in many ways in the book of Esther, the Messiah was in many ways a hidden king. A king who didn't show off or swagger, who didn't burst onto the scene with pomp and circumstance, but who ultimately came to serve. The fact that God works in a hidden way in Esther is meant to fit all of us with the kind of faith that can see and savor the Messiah when he comes onto the scene. Think about it. Jesus arrived in a hidden way. He was born of a young virgin in a backwater village of the Roman Empire, virtually unknown to the larger world. He was born into relative poverty and obscurity. He spent most of his adult life as a blue-collar worker, a carpenter. Not only that, this king conquered in a hidden way too, the way of the cross. He overcomes human sin by taking on what? Sin. He overcame death by what? Dying. Exactly. He disarms Satan by submitting himself to the curse that was enacted upon Adam and Eve because of their disobedience. He secured victory for all who will trust in him by undergoing what to everyone present seemed like a defeat at the time. You realize that no one, not one person who looked upon Jesus dying knew exactly what God was doing. Now, interestingly enough, there was one Roman soldier who was not even part of Jesus' group of friends who recognized who he was. But all of that's meant to show us that God was hiding in plain sight, right before the eyes of all the people. God's kingdom also advances in a hidden way through Jesus too. You know, his kingdom doesn't come like the kingdoms of this world. Unlike Ahasuerus, Jesus doesn't possess military might, nor does he take lands by force. Instead, his spirit moves where he will in sovereign power. And he rescues people from darkness, and one by one makes people citizens of his kingdom. And guess what? Nobody can stop it. No one. A good example of that. Again, if you're taking notes, I want you to write this down. Go to YouTube this week and type in Sheep Among Wolves, Volume 2. It's a movie that was released in August. Forget the name of the filmmaking group, but they produce films, and they release all of their films for free. And this one tells the extraordinary account of the growth of the church in a place that you might least expect it to be growing. Now, I would be careful if you have small kids, whether or not you would want to show it to them. They talk about some things in the movie going on in this particular place that are a bit disturbing, but it is reality. At the beginning of the film, you read these words on the screen. The fastest growing church in the world today has taken root in one of the most unexpected and radicalized nations on earth. Muslim background Iranians are leading a quiet but mass exodus out of Islam and bowing their knees to the Jewish Messiah with kindled affection toward the Jewish people. The Iranian Awakening is a rapidly reproducing discipleship movement that owns no property or buildings, has no central leadership, and is predominantly led by women. It is a fascinating story. And it'll give you an incredible window into God's behind-the-scenes workings in a place where all you and I hear about are the ways in which this particular nation hates the West. And that's there too, especially among leadership. But man, behind the scenes, God's doing something incredible in a pretty unexpected place, through pretty unexpected people. And guess what? That's exactly what's going to happen in the book of Esther. Right there in that place in chapter 1 where the writer says that Vashti was never again to come before King Ahasuerus, and that the king would give her royal position to another who is better than she. Little did anyone know that that one who would be better than she would be one raised up by God himself to be in the right place at the right time, to be an agent of deliverance for God and his people. Deliverance that would come from a completely unexpected place. You know, you and I often get lost in the fog of feeling like God is absent from our present troubles. But you and I need to look to Christ. And we need to look to his cross. And we need to be reminded as we enter into the book of Esther that no matter what it is we're going through, our God is always at work. Even if we can't see his hands, even if we can't trace exactly what he's doing. He was at work at the cross, accomplishing our salvation. He's there at work in the book of Esther, though his name is not mentioned. In the same way, he's at work in all the circumstances of our lives. But sometimes it is hard to see. Esther's contribution to the Bible and Esther's contribution to our lives is to remind us that even when we can't see him, he's there. He's there. And he's working. As we prepare to conclude, I want to invite the worship team up. And I want to ask you to consider something this morning. You know, every one of us are in various chapters of the stories that God has given us to live. It's possible to see all that God's doing to weave our lives into his great big story. The book of Esther is there to teach us we can trust him. The question is, will we? If you're here this morning and you find yourself going through a fog, if you're in a place in your life today where you're like, man, I just wish God would show up. I wish God would make himself clear. I wish God that would let me know that he's there and that he's doing something. I want to invite you to come up to the front and to kneel here. And some people will come around you and pray for you. That God will strengthen your faith to face whatever it is you're walking. If you're here this morning and you look at King Ahasuerus and you go, okay, that's me. I've been chasing down everything under the sun and none of it has filled that gaping, gnawing sense in my heart that I was made for something more. I want to invite you to come. Come and talk with me. Come and let me pray with you. Come and let's talk about a relationship with Christ who came to save us and to fulfill every longing of every empty human. Let's pray. Father.